Rome, summer of the year 189 AD. The air burned over the stone slabs, and yet it was not the heat that agitated the crowd, but hunger and rage. From the poorest neighborhoods of the Subura to the districts closest to the Colosseum, tens of thousands of citizens had united in a single voice. They advanced like an unstoppable river toward the heart of the Palatine, where the emperor's palace rose. 100,000 throats shouted a single name, Cleander. It was not a cry of veneration, not an acclamation of victory. It was pure hatred, a roar born from years of abuse, rampant corruption, and bread increasingly scarce on Roman tables. The fate of a single man had become the obsession of the entire city. And the most surprising thing, that man was not a victorious general, nor a senator of august lineage, nor even an emperor. He was a former Phrygian slave, a man who had arrived in Rome in chains and who, with patience and cunning, had managed to control the most powerful empire in the world from the shadows. How could it be possible that someone born without rights, without a noble name, without military power or inheritance, came to dictate the orders that moved armies and decided the fate of entire provinces? What kind of intelligence and ambition were needed to rise from the dust of slavery to the summit of imperial politics? The story of Marcus Aurelius Cleander is not that of a traditional usurper nor of a rebel who seized power by force. It is the story of a man who understood with brutal clarity something others never knew how to exploit: human weaknesses are more powerful than legions. His rise was the masterpiece of manipulation, and his fall, the inevitable price of having built an empire on the foundations of corruption. This is not just a biography, it is the tale of how Rome, the capital of the world, allowed a slave to become a disguised master. Cleander's name appears for the first time in Rome's records as a simple entry in a wax tablet from the port of Ostia. He was one among hundreds of slaves brought from the eastern provinces to the capital of the empire. He was born in Phrygia, a region of Asia Minor rich in minerals and crossed by ancient trade routes, but also scourged by the trafficking of human beings. Later Senate documents, drafted after his fall, note that he arrived in Rome during the reign of Antoninus Pius, around the mid-2nd century. At that time, the ships crossing the Mediterranean carried not only wheat from Egypt or marble from Greece, they also transported men and women in chains, living merchandise auctioned in the slave markets of the capital. Among them was Cleander, just a boy, marked by the destiny others had written for him. Yet what set him apart was not his hands for hard labor nor his physical strength, but something far subtler: his mind. Cleander mastered several Eastern dialects, quickly learned Latin, and perfected Greek, the language of culture and administration. His mathematical skills made him useful for archival and accounting tasks. While other slaves were sent to fields or workshops, he was assigned to the Imperial Chancery, the place where the empire's most sensitive documents circulated. There, surrounded by scrolls, wax seals, and orders that moved legions, the young slave discovered the true pulse of power. He copied decrees, classified letters, and kept records. For many, it was monotonous work; for him, it was a secret window into the heart of Rome. The first signs of his ingenuity emerged in the year 155, when a grain supply crisis from Egypt paralyzed the city. Experienced officials could find no explanation. Cleander, reviewing letters and reports, dared to suggest that the problem lay not in the wheat fields, but in the corruption of intermediaries who diverted entire shipments. He was right. When his hypothesis was confirmed, he began to stand out as someone with an uncommon ability to understand the human nature behind the numbers. That was his first step toward freedom. Over time, and thanks to exceptional services, he was granted manumission. He ceased to be a service and became a libertus, a freedman with limited rights but already 1 foot inside Roman society. From that moment on, his ambition changed scale. He no longer sought to survive as a useful slave but to rise in a world where noble blood was the currency of power. Cleander lacked it, but he had something many senators and generals never managed to cultivate: patience, memory, and the ability to detect the exact crack in every powerful man. In the year 161, after the death of Antoninus Pius, the throne passed to Marcus Aurelius, the emperor history would remember as the Stoic philosopher. A man inclined to reflection rather than intrigue, a lover of books rather than conspiracies. But even the most virtuous emperors needed men to handle the shadows that accompanied power. Cleander, by then a freedman, found himself in the perfect place at the perfect time. While Marcus Aurelius shared power with Lucius Verus, a man more given to luxury and less to administration, Cleander climbed discreetly. His name began to appear in the records not as a slave, but as a trusted assistant in administrative matters. What made him indispensable was not only his technical knowledge, but his ability to detect patterns. Herodian relates that Cleander compiled authentic secret dossiers, profiles of governors, generals, and senators, with their virtues, debts, ambitions, and fears. It was valuable information that could be used in times of crisis. His clearest opportunity came during the Antonine Plague, the pestilence that ravaged the empire starting in 165. With entire populations decimated and the state apparatus on the verge of collapse, Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus needed quick solutions. Cleander became the man they turned to when no one else had answers. He knew how to organize alternative supply routes, control riots with calculated measures, and ensure that the machinery of the empire kept functioning while death haunted every street of Rome. It was during these years that he gained the personal trust of Marcus Aurelius. The emperor, accustomed to reflecting on the fragility of life, saw in Cleander someone who understood human nature without illusions. This man, people whispered in the palace halls, can read hearts better than books. When Lucius Verus died in 169, Marcus Aurelius was left in sole command. He was a philosopher, yes, but also an emperor worn down by war on the Danube, internal tensions, and the endless plague. The burden was too heavy for one man alone, and that was when Cleander became more than just an advisor, he turned into the emperor's shadow. Documents from that period show Cleander's signature on matters that had once been the emperor's direct responsibility. He was not yet the most powerful man in Rome, but his rise was already unstoppable. When Lucius Verus died in 169, Marcus Aurelius inherited alone the burdens of an exhausted empire, wars on the Danube, the plague still decimating the population, and a senate divided by loyalties and ambitions. Rome needed more than a philosopher emperor, it needed steady hands to keep the machinery of power running. And there, silent but watchful, was Cleander. During Marcus Aurelius' prolonged absences on the front, the Phrygian ex-slave became more than a bureaucrat. He was the guardian of internal stability. Governors knew that the emperor's orders would take weeks to arrive, but a word from Cleander could resolve any crisis within days. It was then that his true strategy began to take shape. Cleander did not seek visible power, but the kind of influence that could not easily be attacked. His method was meticulous. He made himself indispensable by solving impossible problems. He offered favors that created silent debts. He observed, archived, and remembered every weakness of those around him. Herodian assures us that he kept genuine secret archives with detailed information on senators, military commanders, and provincial officials, their alliances, debts, hidden passions. It was knowledge that allowed him to anticipate moves before they happened. His greatest test came in 175, when General Avidius Cassius, governor of the East, proclaimed himself emperor in open rebellion. Rome trembled. But Cleander, instead of panicking, deployed his network of informants. He identified Cassius' sympathizers in different provinces and neutralized them before they could organize. When the revolt abruptly ended with the usurper's assassination, Marcus Aurelius understood that the stability of his empire had depended, in large part, on that freedman-turned-strategist. As a reward, Cleander received the official title of Imperial advisor. But beyond the honor, what mattered was what it implied: direct access to the emperor, control over key appointments, and the ability to pull Rome's strings without arousing suspicion. In those years, while Marcus Aurelius wrote his famous Meditations, reflecting on the meaning of life and virtue, Cleander was writing his own work, an invisible web of power that was carrying him to a place no slave had ever reached before. Between 176 and 180, Marcus Aurelius spent long seasons campaigning on the northern frontiers, fighting the Marcomanni and Quadi in a conflict that drained resources and men. In his absence, Rome needed an administrator capable of maintaining stability. And although the Senate officially retained its authority, in practice it was another who turned the gears of power, Cleander. Administrative documents from this period, some preserved in archives and others described by Cassius Dio, show a revealing detail. Cleander's signature appears alongside decrees on appointments, supplies, and public works. He was not emperor, but he decided who governed provinces, which cities received resources, and which projects were authorized. Rome, without realizing it, was already obeying a former slave. What distinguished Cleander was not only his efficiency, but the subtlety of his control. Instead of appointing simple accomplices, he selected competent candidates who were at the same time vulnerable. Officials with debts, generals with excessive ambitions, or senators with compromising secrets. All of them ended up in positions of power, knowing that their stability depended on the protection of the Phrygian. When in 175 the revolt of Avidius Cassius broke out, Marcus Aurelius once again placed his trust in him. Cleander's network of informants detected conspiracies, neutralized support, and provided the emperor with precise information about the rebel movement. The speed with which Cassius was eliminated demonstrated that Cleander's shadow was as effective as any legion. After quelling the crisis, Marcus Aurelius rewarded him by naming him Consiliarius Principis, official advisor to the prince. It was the formal recognition of a power he already exercised in practice. Under his supervision, Rome experienced a period of surprising efficiency. Taxes were collected punctually, the flow of grain was stabilized, and public works advanced. For many, the invisible hand of Cleander seemed firmer than that of the Senate itself. And yet, that influence was not open, but almost invisible. To the eyes of the people, the emperor was still Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher on campaign. But in the offices of the Palatine, in the letters sent to the provinces, and in the decisions that affected millions, the decisive signature was Cleander's. It was the birth of true power in the shadows, discreet, silent, but increasingly absolute. On March 17 of the year 180, in the military city of Vindobona, today Vienna, Marcus Aurelius exhaled his last breath. The philosopher-emperor who had dedicated his life to reflection and war left behind a legacy of wisdom, but also an exhausted empire. And in his place, a young man of barely 18 years ascended the throne, Commodus, his son. The transition immediately revealed the weaknesses of the new emperor. Commodus, raised among luxuries and flatterers, lacked the discipline and fortitude of his father. He found no pleasure in Stoic philosophy nor in the austere administration of the empire. His interests were banquets, gladiatorial spectacles, and fantasies of grandeur that distanced him from the reality of governing. In that vacuum of effective power, Cleander saw the opportunity he had awaited for years. He was no longer limited by Marcus Aurelius' prudence nor contained by the vigilance of a jealous Senate. With Commodus on the throne, the question was not who ruled Rome, but who truly controlled it. Herodian, a close witness of those years, recounts how Cleander quickly became the indispensable figure for the young emperor. While Commodus lost himself in the thrill of games and pleasures, it was Cleander who kept the empire functioning. At first, he seemed like an efficient administrator. But soon his genius, and his ambition, manifested in a system that would forever change Roman politics, the organized sale of public offices. Until then, bribes were a common part of Roman life, an open secret. Cleander's innovation was turning that chaotic corruption into a systematic mechanism. Governors, magistrates, even military commanders could obtain their posts by paying a set price. The imperial treasury received extraordinary revenues, and Commodus was delighted. He could finance grandiose spectacles without raising taxes, keeping the people distracted and happy. But the true power was not in the gold collected. It was in the debts of loyalty. Every official who owed his position to Cleander knew he also owed his future to him. Governors in distant provinces, generals with entire legions under their command, magistrates in Rome itself, all were bound by the same invisible chain. In just a few years, the Phrygian ex-slave had turned his influence into absolute dominion. Commodus enjoyed the title of emperor, but it was Cleander who directed, with precision and coldness, the gears of the empire. Chroniclers agree, by the year 186, Rome did not obey the Caesar, but his counselor. Between the years 185 and 188, Cleander reached the peak of his power. Officially, he was prefect of the Praetorian Guard, commander of the Imperial Guard. In practice, he was much more, the man whose decisions affected 60 million people from Britain to Mesopotamia. The Senate, once a respected body, had become a silent chorus. No decision was approved without Cleander's consent. Provincial governors sent their reports directly to him, not to the emperor. Military commanders knew that their posts could be purchased, but only on the condition of remaining loyal to the Phrygian. Even justice, which in theory emanated from Commodus, was administered in the corridors where Cleander kept his archives. Cassius Dio described this transformation bluntly: Rome was governed by a man who never wore the imperial purple. For although Commodus appeared in the Colosseum dressed as a gladiator, to the astonishment and scandal of all, it was Cleander who dictated the empire's true policies. His system of selling offices had evolved into an efficient, almost business-like machine. Catalogs listed prices for each position, from a minor magistracy in a remote city to a wealthy governorship such as that of Asia. Buyers did not merely obtain a title, they became trapped in a pact of dependence. Corruption became organized, but paradoxically, the state apparatus functioned with more discipline than in earlier times. The external symbols of his power were equally striking. Herodian tells us that Cleander traveled through Rome in a golden litter, escorted by lictors as if he were a consul. His palace on the Palatine rivaled imperial residences in luxury, Greek statues, Persian tapestries, a library filled with unique manuscripts. An ex-slave who had once arrived in chains now lived like a king in the heart of Rome. And yet, the most extraordinary thing was not his riches or ostentation, but the way he had tamed the emperor himself. Commodus, absorbed in spectacles and his gladiatorial persona, was delighted to have someone else handle the tedious work of governance. For him, Cleander was the perfect solution, an efficient advisor who bore the responsibility while he enjoyed power without its burdens. In those years, Cleander was not just the most powerful man in Rome. In every practical sense, he was the true emperor. At first glance, Cleander's system seemed indestructible. Rome had grain in the markets, the army was paid, and the games kept the people entertained. But beneath that surface of order, tensions were building that would sooner or later erupt. The first sign appeared in the economy. The sale of offices, though lucrative, created a dangerous dynamic. Officials who had paid fortunes to obtain their positions needed to recover their investment. Governors who mortgaged their villas in Italy squeezed the provinces with abusive taxes. Generals who had bought the command of legions charged bribes for peace along the frontiers. The Roman people, instead of being grateful for Cleander's efficiency, began to feel firsthand the hidden costs of his system. The Senate, humiliated for years, had not forgotten. Many senators feigned loyalty but silently awaited the chance for revenge. Chroniclers tell that even among the magistrates bought by Cleander, resentment began to grow. They knew they depended on him, but they hated him for that very dependence. The most serious blow came in the most sensitive area, the grain supply. Rome, a city of more than 1 million inhabitants, depended on wheat shipped from Egypt and Africa. When, in the summer of 189, delays in shipments began, rumors quickly pointed to the man who controlled the entire administration. Herodian recounts that at first people murmured in the markets, accusing Cleander of hoarding grain to enrich himself. As the weeks passed, the murmuring turned into shouts in the forum: bread. We want bread. The price of the staple food skyrocketed and bakeries began to close. Cleander, accustomed to solving crises from the shadows, then made the mistake that would doom him. Instead of offering quick solutions, he sent Praetorian troops to disperse the demonstrators. The gesture, rather than imposing respect, ignited popular anger. The people no longer saw him as an efficient administrator but as a tyrant stealing their bread. Cassius Dio notes that it was in those days that perception changed irreversibly. Cleander ceased to be the man holding the empire together and became the common enemy of Rome. The beginning of his downfall had arrived. The summer of 189 turned Rome into a volcano on the verge of eruption. What began as isolated complaints in the markets became a tide of collective rage. Hunger was an enemy that could not be ignored, and the Romans, accustomed to the state guaranteeing the supply of bread, looked for a visible culprit. That culprit had a name, Cleander. Herodian describes how the streets of the Aventine and the Subura filled with voices demanding justice. The closed bakeries, the empty stomachs, and the rumors of corruption fueled a hatred that was no longer confined to the halls of the Senate. Fury was in the hands of the citizens, and that force was more dangerous than any legion. On June 28, a massive crowd, chroniclers speak of more than 100,000 people, gathered around the Colosseum. They were not spectators but accusers. They abandoned the arena and marched toward the Palatine, the heart of imperial power. Their cries echoed through every street. "Death to Cleander! Give us back our bread!" It was the first time the Roman people had so openly united against a man who did not wear the purple but who everyone knew commanded more than the emperor himself. Cleander, surprised by the magnitude of the protest, resorted to force. He ordered the Praetorian Guard to disperse the crowd. But the strategy backfired. In trying to intimidate the people, he caused their anger to multiply. The riot spread like fire in a dry field. Cassius Dio reports that the cries were no longer only against Cleander, but also against Commodus, accused of allowing his advisor to rob them. The emperor, frightened, understood the danger. If the people associated his throne with hunger, the problem would no longer be a protest, but a revolution. It was then that Commodus made a decision that would change the fate of his most loyal ally. To save himself, he had to deliver Cleander's head. The roar of the crowd reached the walls of the Palatine. Commodus, who had spent his early years of rule protected by Cleander's shadow, felt true fear for the first time, not of the Senate, not of the barbarians, but of the people of Rome. The emperor, desperate to save his throne, made the decision that sealed his advisor's fate. He summoned the Praetorian officers and gave them a cold, simple order: hand Cleander over to the crowd. When the soldiers arrived at the palace of the freedman, they found him surrounded by luxuries few Romans could imagine: oriental tapestries, Greek statues, chests overflowing with gold. But those riches no longer meant anything. His guards had abandoned him, his allies pretended not to know him, and even his servants had fled. The man who had ruled from the shadows suddenly found himself completely alone. Herodian recounts that Cleander was taken to the Forum through the same streets he had silently controlled for years. There, the crowd demanding his death awaited him. There was no trial, no possible defense. The people unleashed upon him all their accumulated fury, the anger of hunger, the hatred of corruption, and the humiliation of having been ruled by a former slave who had gone too far. His last words, recorded by several witnesses, were a mixture of pride and resignation. "I came to Rome as a slave. Today I die having ruled an empire." Cleander's body was dragged through the streets as a warning to anyone who might aspire to power greater than that of the people themselves. With his death, the system he had built collapsed immediately. The Senate celebrated in silence, officials sought new patrons, and Commodus believed he had secured his throne. But the lesson was etched into Rome's memory: no power in the shadows can endure forever when faced with the hunger and fury of the masses. Cleander rose from slave to master of the empire and ultimately fell victim to his own ambition. His story is not just that of one man, but an eternal reminder of the limits of power.